when Sophia approached me about this great idea to have this, and I said, well, I do a lot of things with digital things, but I'm not the most successful person. I'm not really sure I'm ready to talk about some of my projects yet. I've done some work with SketchUp that I ended up going back and having them do paper things again. I do something. I accidentally did a podcast this last semester. We had all the snow days, and for one of the days that we were supposed to have a presentation, they had their PowerPoints done. Their scripts for their presentation should have been done. Some of them apparently weren't. But we'd had one snow day and they were predicting more, right? And so I said, okay, so what I want everyone to do is go and record what you would say onto your PowerPoint in case we have a snow day, so I can have you upload it into a discussion section, because there's no more days left. We're not going to be able to make that up. Or if you're not able to get together with your group, since time was limited at that point, you can type it in the notes section, what you were going to say, right? And then I put them in the discussion. So it was kind of a podcast, right? Sort of a backwards way of doing it. But the thing that I do the most is I'm an art historian, right? So I have students use images, find images, create groups of images that they want to talk about in a paper or essay format or presentation format. And we've been hearing about all of these wonderful things that we can do. And so maybe hold on, I'm gonna pop right out for one moment because we are not in presentation view. And, oh, it says it is. Okay, but it's not showing. Okay.
I'm going to come back.
Well, we're going to have to hope I remember my new order because I can't see my notes. So we've learned all these new things, right? Great. If you're like me, every time I hear about one of these things, I'm like, oh, I'm going to go do podcasts, yay. I send the students off to find some images for their exhibit, their online exhibit, and this is what will happen, right? This is what happens to the students. They go straight to Google and they, say they were reacting to the past game on art in Paris, and maybe they were the student who is Van Gogh, and they want to find an image of Starry Night to use for their exhibition, to propose for their piece in a group exhibition. And so they go to Google and they type in Van Gogh Starry Night, and this is what they get. And you'll notice that none of these images is the same. Right? As an art historian, that's a big problem. Now, for some people using images, maybe that isn't as big a deal. But for an art historian, that's a big problem. Which one is the authentic Van Gogh? And how do I get those students there? And I have had things like, something like this, where this is somebody else's, artwork version. I've had those show up in papers where people will, think that that's the right thing and put it in there. So what I'm here to do is to encourage us all to model how to find good, reputable images from reputable sources, and then how to cite them properly so other people can find them. And because that, citation is something we're supposed to be doing. A few years ago, I was, I'll go back. So when I started as a student in grad school, my first conference that I presented at as an MA student, I was wearing these shoes, by the way. These are my conference shoes. I went to this conference and I used slide projectors. I had carousels, right? And that was the one and only time I ever used them because the world was in the process of transforming to PowerPoint at that moment. And I discovered that over the years that people were just putting these images into PowerPoint and there was no citation, right? Images were just coming from who knows where. and appearing in these PowerPoints, and I had no idea where they were getting them. And from my own self, because I'm an Asianist, the digitization of Asian collections was at least a decade, if not longer, behind where it is for, say, European and American art collections. So when Art Store, which I'll talk about in a little bit, first became available, if you worked in European or American art, great, yay, lots of stuff for you. But for me, in grad school at that time, very limited resources, I had no digital images available. And I was at the University of Minnesota, and our librarians there kindly created a digital collection of most of the slides we had, and I was allowed to create courses, both as a TA and then later as an instructor, from that, which I took with me. And there was no citation of any of those things, right? Nobody was doing that at that time. So I, get so annoyed when this happens with my students, and I realize, well, I'm not modeling for them. I'm using some of my presentations I haven't updated, right? I've added new things, I've switched out new things, but I haven't always, been doing the citation updates as much as I should. At College Art Association conferences, at least a decade ago, people started doing this, right? And there were different ways of doing it. Now it's becoming a little more standardized. And when I go to art history conferences, they do this. When I go to Asian Studies conferences, where there's maybe one other art historian and me, it's very willy-nilly, right? And so across the disciplines, it's done differently. And so I'm here to sort of share the art history perspective on this, and to encourage everybody to go back into your disciplines and encourage folks to come up with something, right? Some kind of standard, so that we don't do this. This is what we don't want. Now, my students generally didn't do that first, because I told them, go to museum websites, right? Find the museum that holds your piece. Usually, the text will tell you where that is. And if you try to do that for some museums, like this particular, no, it won't work here either. Okay, we go, Control. Sorry. This was my one link that was not working. Everything else worked when I came and tested it before lunch. But some museums do not. Some museums will allow people, for scholarly purposes, to download images and use them, right? Sort of the collective commons kind of thing. But some don't. So I can have students go here, and they can see a really nice image from the museum, but there is no way for them to download this, right? They've blocked it in every possible way. They can't copy this and put it into their PowerPoint, right? So then, unless they do a screenshot, now they can get tricky. So, but if they don't know how to do a screenshot, they're frustrated, and they go to Google, and then you get what I just showed you. Maybe they'll remember to come back and look at this and compare it and get the right one, but they might not. So what are some ways around this, right, or to better deal with this? Another example. So I'm showing you things. I showed you the Van Gogh, and that's from a class where I do ask students to do presentations, and then ultimately in their final paper for the class, they propose an exhibition. There's a gender designation with that class, and so the theme of their exhibition has to be around gender in some way, and modern and contemporary art. For this particular example is from my East Asian Gardens class, also a 300 level class where I have them work in groups to using a prompt to design a garden of a certain period. First they do a Chinese garden from 17th century, and it has to be in a scholarly literati Suzhou style, and they have to provide a rationale. So they have to find pictures, right, of sort of the examples of the things they want in their garden, and then they also have to provide a research rationale based on sources that I've given them in class for the most part. And then they do the same thing with a Japanese garden. And what I found was they were, again, still struggling to find, and especially for Asian images, find appropriate kinds of images. And so I might get something like this, you know, labeled Japanese garden. If you go and you Google, this is from Flickr. And if you don't know enough to click further to the original source image, which I tell my students to do, but they don't always do, you know, this Flickr user, Maria H, does say in the what you click in, that it's the Japanese garden at Tatton Park, right? She doesn't say where Tatton Park is, so the student would still have to do that extra research to realize that this is in England and it's not Japanese. And, you know, their eye may not be developed enough at this point to catch certain things about the symmetry of the building and the proportions of the building not quite being right. And certainly the bridge is, you will never see anything like that in Japan. Here is my photo from that same site, which actually shows the bridge. The designer of the garden altered a very common kind of bridge that you'll see in Chinese gardens that some Japanese gardens adopt when they're trying to work in a Chinese style. But he's flattened it to create what he calls an almond shape, right, in the reflection. And that's, as far as I know, unique to this particular garden. And what the student was going for was this, right, is what they were actually trying to find. And this is a moon bridge, so that the reflection creates the full circle here. And so when I'm working, right, with images, this is a particular challenge, right, that I face. But when I go every year to Scholarship and Creativity Day and I see student presentations, I frequently see them without this information. I see lots of images being used, right, without that indication of where they come from. And there are several different schools of thought, and of course style manuals say different things. What I would encourage everyone to do is to let students know which style you prefer, or if you have your own, like I have my own little Professor Brash's, you know, for my classes you do this for captions. Now, most of the time, students, if they know to cite their images, which most don't, they'll do so at the end of their presentation, and that's fine, and that's frequently done. Certainly in art history, right, where we are wanting to emphasize the image, this is distracting, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Some other places, right, so in addition to taking your own photos, as you see what I do, you could also use, and I think you had a lot of students using Wikipedia. That can be a better place, at least than Google. And you can get different sizes, and so talking about sizes can be important, like whether you're doing it on a website, you might not want as big a resolution because it might slow things down, you know, or due to, you know, copyright, this sort of thing. But when you're projecting, you do want the bigger resolution because, and as you can see, this is actually, I want to say it was like 10,000 by 30,000. It doesn't look like that on this projector. Does on my screen, right, a little better. So what I do is, depending, there's this very exhaustive list here at College Art Association of about, I should have counted it. I want to say like 40 open source free image databases. I typically guide my students more to ArtStore, Library of Congress, Wikimedia, and museum websites because that's enough. They get overwhelmed really easily, even with just that amount. And then just say, please, no Google, absolutely no Pinterest, and no Flickr. Right? And those are rules that I write, that, you know, what not to do, right? But if you want more, right, you could look at this, and sometimes for specialized projects, I might pull something from one of these, and there's new sources all the time. But I would really recommend that if you're going to be going more digital and having students using images in their digital projects, to be sure to give yourself some time to talk about sources and to show them where they are and how to use them. How many of you have used ArtStore? Anyone? Yay, okay, so I was just talking earlier this year to some other faculty gathering, and no one had heard of ArtStore. So I mentioned, right, I started off using slides. Art historians who, were in that era of slides, you just had the image. There was no text. There was no option for text, right? The text was either in the handout or in the furious notes that your students would be scrabbling, right, while you were trying to, very slowly say the artist, title, and date. And so there is in some disciplines, right, a preferred aesthetic to remove as much text as possible. So in my classes, I have to explain to students that as an art historian, I don't like texty slides. So when they come to do their presentation, texty slides are a bad thing from my disciplinary perspective. However, I add the caveat that they may, in other classes and in other disciplines, there may be different preferences and that they need to find those out when they go to those classes. However, now I will tell students that I do want a caption, right? Minimally, I want, the artist, title, date, and then, in this case, right, the photographer. And I'm using things that I took photos of so that I don't have to worry about permission. So, but that you would say photo and then the date of the photo, okay? In the case of something like this. Now in class, I might add some additional text, or if they were doing a presentation where they're having to share things that they've seen and learned with their classmates, then they might get to add a little bit of text. And so here might be an example of something that I might talk about in class. What I had been doing for instructions was simply this, right? Where I sort of say, here's where you can find some images. You can scan from your textbooks, and now they all have phones and they can take really awesome pictures of the, images in their books with their phones, and they actually come out okay. I usually have to have a small conversation about cropping. Or I won't be able to see those images, right? There are color copiers in the libraries that you can scan and email the pictures, to yourself, so you don't have to, carry the flash drive with you, or you can do that. You can take photos. I have field trips, for instance, for the modern and contemporary art class. We have a field trip, well, all my classes have field trips, and the garden one too. We have field trips down to museums in the cities, or gardens in the cities, and so I encourage them to take their own photos, right, and use those as much as possible. ArtStore, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. And I show them. We have a few moments in one of the early class periods where I show them how to go into ArtStore and register. And then I just this last semester started making an assignment where they have to go into ArtStore, and I try to pick, tell them to find something that I know they won't be able to find somewhere else, so that they have to go to ArtStore if I can think of something, so that I can see that they have done this. One of the reasons I have them do this is that ArtStore has all kinds of nifty features that you could use. You can create slideshows there that have the metadata right in them, and they'll download it into PowerPoint with the metadata for you. You can create study folders so students, and share them with the students in your class. So if they're preparing for exams, they could use those, or they can create their own study folders if they have their own account as well. So I have been trying to do a little bit more with that as ArtStore has sort of expanded what it will do. Blogs, of course, that's the other one that I often find problematic, where students come in and, where did you get this image? One, you don't have it cited, but where did you get it? Oh, from, XYZ. And it turns out it's a blog site by somebody who I can't find any information on, right? And I said, well, unless you can show me this person is an expert, and that this is an openly sourced image, no. Find something else, okay? So the other thing that I would recommend, best practices for your students, is have them keep track as they're going of where they got their images, right? As I said, coming in the generation where PowerPoint was just, in its birth, I have so many, of my early PowerPoints where I don't know where that image is from. It's just from this digital library that, and I, downloaded it, but I don't know where it came from. So I've had to go back and either rescan those or find other sources for them, and it was a lot of work. And so I don't, students don't want to do that work twice, so make sure they keep track of it like they would for any other source. And in my class, as I said, the minimum requirement is to do the artist title and date, and then a complete citation for their source, which should, since I use Chicago style, look like the same kind of information you would have in a footnote down to the page number. Okay. I prefer that goes on the image, but in a presentation, right, what I encourage students to do is to do what I did here, where maybe you have the image up and I have the students talk about the color. I have them talk about the wabi-sabi elements that they see. Where have we seen this kind of stone basin before? And so I get them to talk about it just looking at the image first. And if I were doing a conference presentation, I might do that as well and do my formal analysis piece first. And then maybe as I move into the context, I might put the label up for those that want that, right? But I want that citation connected. For me, I want it connected with the image. At the end, sometimes it's too hard to tell which citation goes with which image, but that's a personal preference, and as long as my students have a citation at the end, I'm happy, right? But my personal preference is to do it where you show the image alone first so you can enjoy the aesthetics of it if it's an art piece, and take that in and analyze it, and then have your citation. So for instance, and in a paper, right, that's going to look different because you'll have the figure number. And so I show this to the students as an example, and post this then on my Canvas site so that they can refer back to how to do that. And so then I tell them, this is from a text source, so I say the verb changes illustrated in, right? If it's from a website, I say accessed on, right? And then give the date that I downloaded it. But you can still, in a presentation, again, take away, right, that information when you're doing your formal analysis discussion, and then bring it back when you want to be sure that your audience knows where you got the image. Okay. So if you are interested in, at least from the art history perspective, so they've come up with a code of practices for fair use in the visual arts, and they have 5 categories. I've mostly been just talking about what you'll see in category 2, teaching about art, and then if you're publishing, of course, analytic writing. Okay, but of course you can see making art, or my ethics class this fall will talk about museum uses. So they have been thinking about this. So in my discipline, it's something that's been thought about for quite a while, and I'm just not sure that that's true in other disciplines. And so part of my purpose here today was to say, if we haven't been thinking about that, we should be. And if we haven't been modeling this in class, and we're going to start asking our students to do more, right? I have some cautions, right? One would be, getting good sources. What are the reputable sources that they can use. And then 2, showing them how to use them well. And then 3, how to cite them properly so that they're not going to get themselves into any trouble in the future if they are going and presenting at conferences, as I hope many of them will with their undergraduate research. We participate, they have an undergraduate conference for art history at the Minneapolis Institute of Art every year. And so I usually will have a student who has a piece that's, high enough quality that I'll encourage them to take that down there. But the first time I did that, I realized that I had to establish, this whole set of requirements in terms of getting things to me by certain deadlines so that I could make sure that all of these things were being done before releasing them into the world. So I wanted to, for those of you who haven't been into Art Store, I'll take just 1 second to show you. It's
Carol?
really easy. Oh, am I over?
Can I add also for things that ultimately find their way into digital commons?
Yes, oh,
we
thank
have
you.
a problem there too.
Yes,
Students
yes,
have
yes, yes.
Filter their illustrations or haven't kept track of where they came from.
Right, yes, that, I was just talking about that. And so that is another concern that I've had going to the Scholarship and Creativity Day and knowing that a lot of these things are being filmed and then put up. That my concern is that many of these images are just being taken and that there's no acknowledgement given to whoever created that image, whether they created the artwork or whether they were just someone who was documenting the image. Both need to be acknowledged. So it's really easy to get in, and it looks like I am just about out of time, so I'm actually not going to show you, but if you haven't signed up, it's really easy. Their collections are improving all the time. I can get a lot of good Asian material in there now, so if you're a non-Western, I hate that word, but there it is. If you're working on other parts of the world besides Europe or colonial America, there's more and more available to you. It's still less balanced than I would like it to be, but it is better. You do still have to be careful about sometimes there are different size images in there, and so you do need to be aware of that.
One thing I will add here, Creative Commons actually started this new project. It's like a search engine.
Yes.
It will actually search across 19 museums, including Metropolitan Museum. And you can actually filter. There's a lot of Rijksmuseum.
Oh, I should find out.
I'll send you the link.
Yes,
actually.
that would be
It's
fabulous.
searchcreativecommons.org. They would pull images from Flickr too, but you can actually exclude those in your search right
Okay.
now. So you can actually search only that specific museum.
So this is thank you, and I will definitely add that to my list for my students. This is the kind, what I did is I just went in and found 2 images in Art Store, and then I had it downloaded into a PowerPoint, and this is what it sent me, was these 3 slides, right? And you can't, you can see that they're showing it old school art history style with no text, but if I was in presenter view, whoopsies, let me get. So you can see, if I'm in presenter view here, it'll show you, let me get to that. It has all of the metadata from Art Store down in the notes. Right. So if you create a slideshow for your students, they will have all of that right there. Okay. Or if you make them create a slideshow in this way. So Real World also has some problems with this. Recently I was over Christmas break watching some television, something I rarely get to do, and I happened across an episode of Madam Secretary in which there was some political complications around the opening of a Japanese garden. They finally get at the end of the episode to the opening of this garden, except that this is a Chinese garden. And so after last week's workshops on microaggressions, right, well, this is before I was partaking of those workshops, but when I was watching this, I was livid as I'm sitting there thinking, you know, and all of the Asian American actors who had to be there in this. Apparently, any Asian garden is good enough according to the location scout for this show.
Tell them to call you next time.
What's that?
Tell them to call you next time.
Yeah, well, and I wasn't sure, so I went through, I was like, I know I've seen this place, and it turns out, so these are my photos from Snug Harbor, so the Chinese Scholars Garden in New York, and that's where it was apparently filmed, so, and you can see my visual evidence supporting my, my claim here. So my thoughts for myself, things that I hadn't been doing very well, that I'm starting to do better at, to be sure that I share with students the copyright and fair use rationale, that I give really explicit instructions on finding reputable image sources and demonstrate how to use them, retrofit any remaining PowerPoints that might not have complete citations so that I can be modeling proper scholarly behavior for my students, and giving explicit instructions on how I want them cited, because it might be different in different places, and as a part of that discussion, talking about those discipline-specific issues, and making sure that the final message that they get is that the accuracy of both the representation and the citation matter. So, thank you. Any questions? And if you have other questions or want those website details, you can email me here and I will be happy to get that for you, and I need that.
I already emailed you.
I'll have an additional
It's your
thing,
inbox.
additional tool soon. Any questions or other concerns? Thank you for sharing. Okay, thank you.